Bom dia a todos. Estamos ao vivo em mais uma reunião geral do Departamento de Psiquiatria da Faculdade de Medicina da Universidade de São Paulo. Com grande alegria que hoje nós temos aqui um grande colaborador e pesquisador do nosso instituto. Além dele, contamos com a presença da professora Lizzie Shepard, do professor Orestes Forlença, o nosso professor associado e chefe do Departamento de Psiquiatria, e o professor Eurípides Constantino Miguel, que atualmente é o vice-chefe do Departamento de Psiquiatria. Eu vou apresentar o professor David Ross, e depois eu vou mudar para o inglês, que é quando iremos começar essa aula. O professor David Ross, ele é psiquiatra, doutor em neurociência, professor de psiquiatria no programa de pesquisa em neurociências da Universidade de Yale, coordenador da residência em psiquiatria do adulto e do currículo médico da Yale University. Como vice-coordenador do National Neuroscience Curriculum Initiative, tem atuado intensivamente desenhando estratégias, implementando e disseminando neurociência na formação de psiquiatras. Hoje ele vai falar sobre um tema, Integrating Neuroscience, a Vision of 21st Century Psychiatry. E para comentar, temos a doutora Elizabeth Shepard. Ela possui graduação em psicologia e mestrado em neurociência cognitiva social pela Universidade de Aberdeen, Escócia, e doutorado em psiquiatria pela Universidade de Nottingham, na Inglaterra. Ela trabalhou como pesquisadora de pós-doutorado no Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, do King's College, e atualmente é Young Investigator, Jovem Pesquisadora em Neurociência Cognitiva no Departamento de Psiquiatria da Universidade de São Paulo. Eu queria, antes de começar, só dizer que durante a apresentação eu vou colocar eu vou avisar os residentes para a gente fazer uma lista de presença, só para a gente saber quem está participando da reunião geral. So, it's a great pleasure to have Professor David Ross here with us. And Professor David Ross, it's you can start your talk.
Let's see. All right, hopefully you're now seeing my screen.
Yes.
We good? All right, wonderful. Rodolfo, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to be with you. I only wish I could be there in person. So for thousands of years, humans have struggled with mental illness and tried desperately to treat it. So this skull is thought to be more than 4,000 years old, and it shows clear evidence of trepanation. And this is a 16th century Dutch painting in which you see a surgeon operating on someone with mental illness. And the image is chilling. And it speaks to a complex tension of realizing that mental illnesses are brain diseases, and at the same time being hopelessly unable to impact their course. And if you just stare, you see the profound suffering of the patient, the look of disgust, anger, and disdain in the woman above, and the intense clinical focus of the surgeon, who's trying to do the best that he can with the tools of his time. But the reality is that the tools of his time were woefully inadequate. And with no ability to understand the disease process, there was no hope for effective treatment. And so we have trepanation and bloodletting and indefinite involuntary confinement for the incurables, as illustrated in this print from 1789. And don't let the cartoonish style fool you. This was a grim era. It wasn't until the mid to late 19th century that early pioneers used lesion studies and gross anatomical observations to begin making first steps towards understanding the biological basis of psychiatric illness. So Broca, Jackson, Solomon Carter Fuller, the first African-American psychiatrist who made seminal contributions to our understanding of what was later named Alzheimer's disease. But these tools were obviously still limited. And so others undertook the crucial work of nosology, trying to parse madness into distinct diagnoses. So Emile Kreplin was one of the leaders of this movement. And to try to make sense of symptomatology, he made detailed phenomenological observations of patients over long periods of time. And he recorded these data on individual index cards, because this was the state of the technology. And it was these observations that ultimately led him to propose the distinction between dementia praecox and manic depressive insanity that is still foundational in modern diagnostic schema. Freud himself was similarly interested in understanding the biological basis of mental illness, but he too was ultimately frustrated. Research has given irrefutable proof that mental activity is bound up with the function of the brain as it is with no other organ. But every attempt to go on from there has miscarried completely. There is a hiatus here which at present cannot be filled. Without having tools that could offer meaningful insight into causality, treatments remained woefully inadequate, from the seemingly absurd hydrotherapy to insulin shock therapy to lobotomies, and perhaps most upsetting, the idea of the schizophrenogenic mother. And these weren't acts of evil, though the consequences were profoundly negative. These were all people who were doing the best that they could with the tools of their time. And so the state of the field through the mid-20th century is perhaps best captured in this. When the DSM-3 was being created, there was a clear recognition that we didn't understand the pathophysiology of mental illness. But there was still a desperate need to at least agree on what we call things. And so the authors made the deliberate choice to focus on outwardly observable characteristics and to essentially abdicate biology. And so I am grateful that we can all now acknowledge that the world has changed. And we finally have access to a set of tools that allow for the systematic study of psychiatric illness. And if we just look at everything that's happened in the past 30 years, if we go back in time to 1991. So 1991 was the year in which the first paper was published reporting on this newfangled technology called functional MRI. In the years since, we've learned to wield this tool with increasing power through resting state imaging, network connectivity approaches, and increased signal resolution down to the level of specific cortical layers. In 1991, the conventional limits of light microscopy were on the order of hundreds of nanometers. Storm imaging now enables us to image the cell at 10 times that resolution, allowing us to visualize the inner workings of the cell with unprecedented power. These cellular tools are crucial, allowing us to better understand fundamentals of brain biology. For example, we can now observe the function of neurons in vivo, from watching them fire in real time to seeing how they change across much longer intervals. So this image shows an individual neural stem cell in an adult mouse hippocampus in green, generating daughter neurons over the span of 2 months in yellow, orange, and then red. So just to be clear, neurogenesis in vivo in an adult mammal. When I was in medical school, we were taught that this was categorically impossible. And what's amazing is we're seeing how these basic tools are combining and now translating into advanced and creative lines of research that strike at the very heart of cognitive neuroscience. So this one's my favorite image. This is from Susumu Tanagawa's lab, in which they've been able to tag the specific neurons activated in the hippocampus during an event so as to identify the unique memory engram for that specific episodic memory. And they've used this approach not only to define core aspects of the neurobiology of memory, but for a range of cool applications. So to create new memories, to alter old memories, in animal models of disease to help recover lost memories in an animal model of Alzheimer's, and to reverse depressive symptoms by reactivating old positive memories. It's not just animal work. We're seeing similar revolutions in the tools and approaches we can use in human studies. So when we talked about genetics 20 years ago, the focus was on specific genes. The work was slow, expensive, and it was limited to small samples. So this is the main figure from one of the seminal papers on Disc 1, looking at 87 members of one family. This paper was published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2001. The Human Genome Project was completed that same year at a cost of almost $3 billion. Since then, we've seen the cost of whole exome sequencing plummet to the point where we can now expect that patients may show up in our office having already completed their own genetic testing. More importantly, next-generation sequencing is offering exponentially more powerful tools. So whole genome sequencing, including non-coding regions, epigenetic factors, and looking directly at the transcriptome so we can better understand the complex interplay between environment and biology. And critically, as computational tools have become fast and cheap, it's now possible to use massive data sets. So from 87 people in that DISC-1 study to a paper last year from the Psychiatric Genetics Consortium that involved 230,000 cases and nearly 500,000 controls. Unimaginable, even a decade ago. Together, this research is allowing us to better appreciate the complexity of psychiatric illness and to begin defining them based on the underlying biology rather than their outward appearance. In 2007, the field of psychiatry was shaken by the first description of Nmda Encephalitis, the recognition, the panic, that there was a subset of patients that were being diagnosed as having schizophrenia, but actually had a distinct pathophysiology. Newer work is suggesting this might be just the tip of the iceberg. There may be a range of autoimmune syndromes with anti-brain antibodies that we haven't seen because we didn't know where or how to look. Just a couple of months ago, a stunning example. Identifying a new anti-brain antibody in a patient with post-COVID catatonia that then successfully resolved with IVIG treatment. And this is, of course, only part of our growing appreciation of the interconnectivity between organ systems, of neuroimmune functioning, of the gut-brain axis and the microbiome. And we can see through this work the insidious, destructive role of dualism, as if we could separate mind from brain and brain from the rest of the body. This is not just in the lab. This is work that's already translating into clinical practice. So to date, we've had 70 years of antidepressants that look like this. They all act through the monoaminergic system, and they don't work nearly as well as we would like. So depending on how you count, a third or more of patients won't respond. Thanks to modern research, we now have ketamine as a novel, rapid-acting treatment that works through the glutamatergic system and involves BDNF. We now have brexanolone for postpartum depression, arguably the first effective psychotropic medication to be prospectively developed based on our understanding of the underlying neurobiology. All of this work paves the way for precision psychiatry. With new understanding of the biology, we can implement new forms of treatment, whether through meds or through interventional tools like RTMS or transcranial direct current stimulation, deep brain stimulation, or more radically through brain-machine interfaces. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this example from the 2014 World Cup of a man who had been paralyzed for 10 years and with the help of a brain-machine interface kicked out the first ball. Or just last month, the story of a man with severe anarthria, spastic quadriplegia following a brainstem stroke, who received an implant that then enabled speech interpretation and production. Simply unbelievable stuff. So around the time of the World Cup in Brazil, in the midst of this wave of excitement, then director of the NIMH, Tom Insel, wrote an editorial with the title, The Future of Psychiatry is Clinical Neuroscience. And his piece and many others captured this amazing moment in history. I was looking for a fun way to visualize this. I couldn't resist putting up a picture of Sigmund Freud alongside of Carl Deisseroth as a reflection of the change. And I suppose it's only fair, if we're going to include Carl, that we should put one of his optogenetic rats there as well. And I don't show this image to suggest that neuroscience is replacing psychotherapy or that the two paradigms are mutually exclusive. Quite to the contrary, as Carl would be the first person to say, there's tremendous value in looking across reductionist levels. But there is no doubt at this point that our understanding of psychiatric illness is increasingly rooted in brain science. But Tom's article pointed us to an uncomfortable truth. Around the same time, there was a paper in Academic Psychiatry surveying psychiatry residency program directors. And at the time, 95% of them thought that it was important that we teach neuroscience, but virtually none of them were. suffice it to say, this gap is troubling. And if you can please indulge me, I'm going to organize the first part of this talk around residency training for a couple of reasons. So foremost, because our trainees today are going to be the leaders of our field for the next 50 years. And more so because the problems we face when we think about residency education are representative of the problems faced by the field as a whole. And so when Dr. Insel writes about the future of psychiatry as clinical neuroscience, to me, it's not enough. We're talking about the very identity of our field. So my question would be, why aren't we teaching it this way today? The biggest answer is clearly just how new everything is. If we just think about everything that's happened in the past 30 years. But it's more than that. So a second major issue comes at a systems structural level. For residency programs, the system level in the US, at least, is about the ACGME, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, and they put out this document listing all of the things that have to happen during residency training. And if you look through this document, it's 38 pages and more than 10,000 words. And you'll find all sorts of stuff in here of every kind of therapy that you have to do and different types of clinical experiences, down to mandated nap times for residents when they're on call. I'll leave it to you to guess what word does not appear anywhere in the program requirements. Right. So if you're keeping score at home, naps 1, neuroscience 0. This is finally beginning to change a little bit with the Milestones Project, which is a new way to think about training experiences and what needs to happen. And they acknowledge the existence of neuroscience, but I can say as someone who was involved in helping create this new milestone, it is still woefully underrepresented. So why talk about this? What impact do these regulations have on programs? Well, programs have to follow the requirements, and the requirements largely track with the history of our field. So as new ideas and approaches have developed, they've been added in. And so if you look at a traditional curriculum, they often follow this sort of vestigial organization. So there's a series of courses, and the courses are divided into a series of lectures. And if you wanted to look at a topic like PTSD, you might have one course on diagnosis and phenomenology and nosology, another on psychodynamics, on psychopharmacology, on CBT. If you're lucky, maybe you get some psychosocial rehabilitation. And if you're really, really lucky, maybe you get some neuroscience. And I have to admit, as an educator, as a course director, as a curriculum director, it would be wonderful if the world worked this way. And we could parse everything into these neat little categories. And it would appeal to the OCPD in all of us, or at least the OCPD in me. But of course, this is not the way the world works. And the beauty of psychiatry is in how do all of the pieces fit together. And so if we wanted to think about a topic like PTSD in this day and age, fundamentally, any conversation has to begin with what happens in the brain following a traumatic event. And you get fear conditioning and dysregulation of the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. And once you appreciate that basic biology, you realize any meaningful treatment is going to have to include a component of exposure therapy to extinguish that fear conditioning. And now we can start digging into all the really cool science that's going on. So what if we had a way to increase the intrinsic plasticity of the brain, whether through a medication or an interventional approach, so that you might be able to get through that exposure therapy in 5 or 6 sessions instead of 10 to 12? Or what if there's this whole new line of research showing that anytime a memory becomes activated, it becomes momentarily labile and then has to be reconsolidated? What if we could disrupt that reconsolidation process so that you might be able to split off the negative affect from the episodic trace? And this is work that's already been shown in both animals and in humans, behaviorally, interventionally, and pharmacologically. A really cool recent paper in the Green Journal showing that they were able to do this with propranolol under specific controlled circumstances. And of course, if we step back, we know for any particular type of trauma, it's only going to be 10, 20, 30% of individuals who may go on to develop PTSD. So how do we think of that? And it may be that it's not the event per se so much as the way an individual interprets and contextualizes that event within their own life narrative. And so we might want to start thinking about cognitive approaches to therapy. And of course, as psychiatrists, we love talking about meds and therapy. But how do we think about the robust literature from psychosocial rehabilitation approaches? So things like supportive employment, supportive housing, family psychoeducation, all of which have much larger effect sizes than the medications that we prescribe. And at the end of the day, how do we make sure that this is about the person who's sitting in front of us? So what's it like to go to Iraq and spend 14 months where you're convinced every day that you're going to die? And then you try coming home and you try driving on a freeway that reminds you of an IED explosion. Or you try shopping in a mall and you find that the crowd is just too stimulating. The art of psychiatry today is clearly how do we think deeply about all of these different types of data and perspectives, and how do we bring them to bear for the person sitting in front of us? So let's imagine that you had a program that said, yes, we want to implement a new curriculum. They still face a number of intense challenges. So first, the field is vast. What should we actually be teaching when things are changing too quickly for anybody to keep up, even if you're inside the field? Where and when do you fit it into a curriculum that's already overflowing with all of those other requirements? Who's going to teach it? If you're at a major academic center, maybe you have people with neuroscience backgrounds, but most of our programs don't. And maybe most importantly, how do we teach it well? So for most of the programs who are even trying to teach it, the default approach is to bring in experts with content knowledge and to have them lecture on their specific areas of expertise. And we live with this fantasy that we could just line up our residents and we could stage a dramatic reading of Charney and Nestler or whatever our favorite textbook was, and our trainees would magically remember everything that we say. But the data are clear. This approach does not work. Less than 5% of content presented in a lecture format is going to be retained, and that's probably optimistic for neuroscience. So there's an entire field of scholarship on how adults learn. There is a tragic irony if, as the psychiatrists and neuroscientists studying how people learn, we fail to take this into account in the way that we teach. So if we just step back, the traditional GME, graduate medical education model, has historically entailed a series of central regulations that need to be implemented at the individual program level. And for cutting-edge content like modern neuroscience, my argument would be it does not work. Our regulatory systems are too complex to adapt quickly, and designing cutting-edge curricula is too resource-intensive for any program to be able to do on its own. So looking forward, the future of medical education has to be, how do we all work together to achieve a common goal? And my central thesis would be, in the same way that cutting-edge science requires teamwork and collaboration, so too does cutting-edge education. And so to this end, about 8 years ago, a group of us got together and we formed the National Neuroscience Curriculum Initiative. And our goal from the beginning was to create a set of open resources that would help improve teaching of neuroscience in psychiatry. Now, of course, it's not just about teaching residents, right? This is a question, how do we all integrate neuroscience into our practice? And this is work that I've been delighted to do with Melissa Arbuckle, who's the program director at Columbia, and Mike Travis, who's at Pittsburgh. And with a recent philanthropic gift, we now have 2 new co-chairs joining our team, Ashley Walker and Joey Cooper. And when we first created the NNCI, we started by defining a set of guiding principles and imagining what would these look like in a classroom setting. And so, foremost, we knew it had to be an integrative, patient-centered approach to care. How do we take cutting-edge neuroscience and bring it alongside all of the other rich traditions in our field? It has to be rooted in principles of adult learning. It has to be experiential. It has to be, how do we engage our trainees with the content in a meaningful way? It has to be easy to implement, so anyone, anywhere would feel comfortable picking up these resources and using them. And last and certainly not least, it should be fun. So Melissa gave a podcast interview recently where she was saying, remember when we were in kindergarten and going to school and learning was fun? When did it stop being fun? And why? Why can't learning be fun? And so for us, we take fun rather seriously. And so, we started, one of the first topics we went after was thinking about basic neuroanatomy. And this is really important, but it's one of these topics that is often taught in a dry and relatively inaccessible manner. And so we approach things very differently. We start by handing out Play-Doh and asking people to build a brain out of Play-Doh. And we give them a video so they can follow along.
Hello, my name is Josh Gordon from Columbia University, and I'm going to show you how to build your brain out of Play-Doh.
I hope the sound is coming through with this as well. So this is in fast forward. This is not the actual speed. The actual video is about 7 minutes long. And as he goes through, Josh is describing each region, its function, and how it may be implicated in different forms of psychopathology. It's an amazing video, and it's a really cool kinesthetic learning experience where you really get immersed in the content and engage with it in a way that we typically don't. And of everything we've ever done with the NNCI, this one has been far and away the most popular. I think one of my favorite modules is one that we call Neuroscience in the Media. I'm sure you all have the same experience as we do here, which is part of being a psychiatrist is you have people come up to you at parties and they say, hey, did you see that article on the front page of the newspaper that Tetris cures PTSD? Or women who eat full-fat yogurt are happier, so don't believe the smug lady in the Yoplait Light commercials. I don't make up the headlines, I just make fun of them. So for us, this is a core learning objective. We want our residents to be ambassadors of neuroscience who can thoughtfully communicate about these topics with a broad audience. And so we said, okay, let's do that in the classroom. So for this module, we start each session by reviewing popular media content together, whether it's an article from the newspaper or from BuzzFeed or the Huffington Post or your favorite podcast or TV show. And we start by appraising the media together. What was the central claim of the media? What was the author's agenda? What biases did they seem to have? Spoiler alert, the answer to that is almost always stigma towards psychiatric illness. What questions do you imagine a patient or a family member would ask if they saw this piece of media? What questions did you have when you experienced this media? And then we go and we look in the literature, we find the papers that answer these questions, and then everybody has a chance to role play. How would you talk to a lay audience about this particular piece? So one of my favorite examples of this is a piece from Radiolab, the podcast, where there's a British journalist who is flown to a secret army base outside of San Diego, and they zap her brain with electricity and train her to be a sniper. It sounds kind of ridiculous. When you dig in, it turns out there's actually some really good science behind it. So it's a piece about transcranial direct current stimulation. And certainly at the time that we were first doing this, very few people had heard about TDCS. And so if you wanted to dig into this piece, for anybody who wants to implement it, there's a facilitator's guide. It has all the questions. It has answers to all the questions. It has a sample script for a role play. So anybody could pick this up and run that session. One more module I want to flag. One of the most pressing issues facing the field of medicine before COVID and now even more in the wake of COVID is physician burnout and depression. And there's a beautiful graphic editorial in The Guardian right before the pandemic, actually, that really highlighted this. I'd very much recommend you check it out. And so we wanted to find a way to teach core data about physician wellness and depression, and to facilitate dialogue around this crucial topic. And so what we did is we created Intern Year, the educational board game. And it's part of this new genre of cooperative board games. So you're not playing against each other. You're all playing together as a team against the game itself. And the game begins by each person adopting a character. And each character has its own unique strength and vulnerability. And across the span of the game, your character will change based on their physical health, their emotional health, and their clinical performance. And as the game begins, you get a rotation schedule and you start going on rotations onto different services, and events happen. You draw cards. It may be a bad code, or a patient dies, or a conflict. And these events have consequences, and your characters change. Some of them may struggle, and some of them may become clinically depressed with real consequences. And at the end of each rotation, there's a group exercise that gives people the chance to reflect on one of the core themes relating to physician wellness. So thinking about what is stress, what is resilience, what's the difference between burnout and depression, thinking about learned helplessness as a model of depression, thinking about different coping strategies, and of course, thinking about all of the structural factors that impact physician wellness, because we know that most of this problem resides at the system level. So it's just a really rich way to engage with people around an important topic in a personal and memorable way. A ton of other stuff that we've designed for classroom teaching, I won't go into. And I have to admit, after 2 years of really focusing on classroom teaching, we were feeling pretty good about ourselves. We said, yeah. And then we stepped back for a minute and we thought about it and we said, okay, if we designed the perfect set of classroom teaching resources, maybe it would include 100 hours of neuroscience content, which frankly is ambitious beyond any possibility. But even if you've done this, this is still only the tiniest fraction of what happens during training. So during their residency with us, our trainees are going to have 9,000 plus hours in their clinics. And during that time, they're most likely working with faculty who are not neuroscience experts, in which case the content is probably not being reinforced. And so you might have something of a hidden curriculum emerge. That neuroscience is this thing that we talk about in the classroom, but it isn't actually relevant in the real world. And so we shifted our focus to start thinking about how do we help integrate neuroscience into the clinical aspects of training. And one way we've done this is through our Talking Pathways to Patients module. And here we recognize that many of the things we say to our patients are relics of an older past. We talk about chemical imbalances. We focus on diagnostic labels that reflect broad syndromes rather than any underlying biological process. We owe it to our patients to be able to explain as best we can what is actually going on. And so this is a module where we give participants the chance to learn and then practice this specific skill. Another of my favorites here is what we call clinical neuroscience conversations. And this one was designed to explode the default hierarchical model of medical education, that the teacher needs to know everything about every topic and impart wisdom from on high. So this is all about how today, in the era of the internet, how can we all learn together? How can we teach when our faculty are not experts in the content, and instead say, let's all engage with these resources together? And so here again, each session starts with a case. It could be a case that we give you or a case that you're seeing on your own clinical service. And we say, how would you think about this case today if you were treating them? And now here's a brief video that's going to illustrate one core neuroscience content. And then we're going to have you go back and think again, how would this content shape your formulation? So I think my favorite example of this approach is a case of functional neurological disorder. And of course, the question with FND is this real or are they just faking it? I was looking for an image. This was the closest I could come to, are they just faking it? And these videos are designed so once you see them, you will never think about this case in the same way again. So, okay, at this point, I want to pause and acknowledge that there's a little bit of an irony here, that I began by saying we don't believe that lectures are effective, and I've now been talking for approximately 30 minutes. It's too much. And so what I want to do instead is give you a little bit of a taste through an online exercise of what these resources are like to engage with. So I'm going to introduce you to a module that we call What to Say When Patients Ask. And the setup here is relatively simple. If we were doing this in person, I'd have you pair off and role play. Instead, I've adapted it for the online space. You're going to be working through a web interface, so I'll have you open a different tab in your browser. And we'll circle back to that in a second. So the setup for these is you're going to have a case vignette. And the very basic question, if this person walked into your clinic today, how would you respond? I'm going to give you a resource. There will be a hyperlink in there that you can review. And then ideally, what I want you to be able to do is to have a group discussion. Again, if you were together in a room, that's easy as is. I understand that the trainees all have WhatsApp threads. Please use the WhatsApp. Talk about the case through the WhatsApp thread. How would you think about the case? How would you think about this resource? And after this resource, well, how does this change the way you would approach the patient? What's one thing you would do differently? And at the end of this, there's an answer key of sample scripts. I'll flag that the case that I've given you is one that in some ways is very American and reflects the socio-political climate up here. But my understanding is that the issues that you'll see represented in this content are things that will also feel familiar to you with different flavors and with different unique elements, but broadly similar. This is faster than I would typically do this in the real world. If we were doing this together in a room, I would probably spend 40 or 45 minutes. So this is going to be really fast. You're not going to have time to go through everything. It's okay. I want you to have a sense of what it would feel like to play with these resources. And I hope it will stir up some conversations that you can continue afterwards and can carry on beyond this particular session. So the link that you're going to use is tinyurl.com/NNCI-USP. I'm going to put that up again in a second, so you don't need to frantically type it right now, but that's the link. You're going to open it in a separate browser window. When you hit that, it's going to take you to a page that's going to ask you whether you want to create an account, continue anonymously, or log in. You do not need to create an account, just click continue anonymously. It will then give you a very silly username. Just click yes, continue. You'll then see a screen that looks like this. It'll say NNCI Grand Rounds, and underneath NNCI WTS Racial Trauma. You're going to click here to select the scenario. It'll say Run Scenario. And then it's going to take you to some consent screens. There's a whole backstory on this. You can basically ignore them. It does not matter whether or not you consent. You can say yes, you can say no. Either way, it will take you into the resource. So you're going to click yes and then continue. Okay, so the link again is tinyurl.com/NNCI-USP. You'll have a case, review a resource. I'd recommend doing those first two things on your own, and then please lean on your WhatsApp, connect with friends and colleagues, think together, what were the key take-home points from this? How would you think about the case differently? One thing you do differently, and then a key sheet to look at on your own. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to give you 15 minutes to do this. If you have questions, you can send a message to Rodolfo, and he'll send it to me, and we can sort it out that way. Okay? So on your marks, get set, go.
For me, it's a little slow. Are you guys being able to get it well?
Hi, Yuri.
For me, it's a little slow. You get it?
No, oh yeah, and now we have 15 minutes of exercise.
The access, I'm having a little difficult to access.
Okay.
I just want to know if you guys are having difficult as well.
No, in my computer, it's okay.
It's okay. Okay, that's my internet probably.
No, for a resident, please WhatsApp me if you have any questions or if you want to discuss something.
I got it now. Thank you. Got it. Thank you.
I'm hearing that there's a couple folks who may be having trouble accessing the link. So let me just find you. There's a backup. If you can't get onto that site, a little tricky because I'll have to figure out how to get this to you. I'm going to quit my screen share and then I'll put this into my slide. Give me 1 second to do that. Okay. If you're having trouble, what I want you to do is just add the number 2. I just made a brand new link. So go tinyurl.com/NNCI-USP, add the number 2, so USP2. And then it's going to take you to a totally different site, but it should still work about the same way. So if somebody who's having that trouble can text Rodolfo and let me know if that works instead. And let me add that into the slide really quick. Okay, so now either of those should work for you.
Some people is telling me that that's working on their smartphones. But here in my computer, it's working well, but I'm using Google Chrome. I don't know if someone is using like Internet Explorer, or it could have some trouble. So if you want to switch for Google Chrome to Google Chrome, I think it could help.
The other thing I'm going to do is get the link for the master document so that anybody can go back to it afterwards.
Hi everyone. Please, we're gonna take 5 more minutes, okay? 5 more minutes. I think it's fair.
So maybe just one more minute. And again, I realize it's not enough time to work through everything, but hopefully it's enough to get a sense of how it would work and plant the seed. All these resources will obviously still be there after the talk, and you can go back and you can finish and have discussion. All right. So again, with all of those caveats, I hope this gives you an introduction, a flavor, and again, you can circle back later, and maybe we can think together at the end. So again, we had spent a couple of years working on this, and we were feeling pretty good, and then we stepped back and we said, even if we completely transformed our classroom and clinical settings, there's still a wide world beyond the walls of our ivory tower and our major academic centers, and not just in a geographic sense, but also at a system and structural level. We know that our systems of care are evolving, and the idea of a lone psychiatrist practicing on their own is dying. So when we started working on this, we thought that this was going to be an initiative primarily for psychiatry residents. And this is my sophisticated artist rendition of a psychiatry resident, and you can tell it is because they're happy. And there's a label that says psychiatry resident. But almost as soon as we began, we realized the audience was much broader. Medical students, attendings, other MDs, psychologists, social workers, APRNs, and of course, patients and families. And so we said, okay, how do we engage with this broader audience, and how do we bring neuroscience to everyone? And so we started with all of the usual types of outreach approaches through social media. For us, a very big part of this has always been faculty development. We're asking faculty to teach content that they're not familiar with in a way that they might not be used to. And so we want to offer as much direct support as we possibly can, and we've done this through the annual Brain Meeting, which is a big conference we run for training directors in the US, and through relationships with a number of other key organizations and presentations and workshops that we've done with them. Of course, the most important thing is having resources that are accessible. And so for us, we built the website. It's nncionline.org. Everything on the website is free and openly accessible. You have to create a login that's just so we can track usage for our funders who insist that we track usage, but everything's free. And I just want to flag two of our favorite resources there. One is a series of clinical commentaries that we've been writing in biological psychiatry. And each one of these is designed to capture one core concept in neuroscience and make it clear, relevant, and accessible for a broad audience using a narrative approach. So these are not traditional scientific articles. They're meant to be easily engaging for people who don't already have content expertise. The other is a series of mini talks that we conceptualized as being something of a hybrid between a moth story. So these are true stories told live in front of an audience without notes. A TED Talk, I think everybody knows what TED Talks are, and Pechakucha Talks. So Pechakuchas are 20 slides, 20 seconds per slide. So a talk that is 6 minutes and 40 seconds long. And we wanted each of these to be designed to present a single perfect neuroscience moment. One moment that was going to make the audience say, wow, this stuff is really cool. And so we cleverly, or not so cleverly, call them our This Stuff is Really Cool talks. And if you go on the website, you'll find, I think, about 60 of the clinical commentaries and probably about 30 of these mini talks. And so this is what we were thinking about before 2020. And when the pandemic first started, that first week, we had this crazy thought. We were all at a conference with this whole new COVID thing. What are we going to do if residents get stuck in quarantine for 2 whole weeks? Can you imagine being stuck at home for 2 whole weeks? And we said, what if we could create an online course that could engage residents where they're at, in this case, literally. And we called it the quarantine curriculum. And what was cool is we were able to bring together a team of amazing educators to create a 14-day curriculum. And we thought in the moment, that this would be for residents. But it turned out, again, it was more popular for everybody else. So starting with the medical students, the residents were still working. It was the medical students who were sent home and had no experience whatsoever. And then we iterated it, and we found a lot of mental health professionals from all different disciplines and from all over the world who were really interested in this. And the last time we ran this course, it ultimately modified into something we're now calling Brain 2021. We had participants from 6 continents participating in this. It was really cool. And now people can take it for CME credit. We have residency programs who are using it as their neuroscience curriculum. And for us, we're excited that it includes both core content in psychiatric neuroscience, and even more that it's designed to capitalize on principles of adult learning as they apply in the online space. So really cool, no easy feat to do. All right, so how are we actually doing with all this? From our perspective, the first question was, can we actually do this? Can we generate content in a collaborative manner? And here it's been great. We've been able to generate a ton of content from many authors and many institutions. And for us, the primary goal has always been, are people using the resources? And in this regard, the data are really fantastic. So it's now more than 100,000 unique users with more than 1 million page views from 171 countries. And in the US, it's 200 plus training programs that are now using this as part of their main curriculum. So, okay, well, where does this leave us today? I think despite all of the amazing scientific progress, we still know that the field as a whole remains in crisis. Depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. In the US last year, we had 40,000 people die from suicide, and that's more than 800,000 worldwide. The US has been particularly hard hit by the opioid epidemic, with more than 3 million people with opioid use disorder, and more than 90,000 people died from overdose last year, more than double the number of suicides. And what's astonishing is that if you look at that population, more than 80% of individuals with opioid use disorder do not get standard of care treatment. And there's lots of complicated reasons for how that is. But at least one part of the story is because of the stigma that still pervades our field, of a broad societal moral model that blames victims for their suffering. And it's not terribly different than where cancer was 70 years ago. We didn't understand its biology, treatments were crude and ineffective, and change could not happen without substantive biomedical research. And psychiatry is now right on the cusp of this same transformation. So if we think of opioid use disorder as an exemplar, society as a whole is still here, blaming individuals for poor choices and criminalizing illness, especially for individuals from minority groups who are prosecuted and incarcerated at much higher rates than other people. We finally have the tools to make an impact, but we're not going to make progress with this. Right? We need to be the generation of psychiatrists that can step up, and we're going to do so by embracing the reality that the diseases we treat are brain diseases. And so if we want to talk about opioid use disorders today, any conversation needs to begin with the recognition that this is a brain disease, and it is more heritable than most medical conditions that we treat. It's more heritable than breast cancer, than coronary artery disease, than diabetes. This vulnerability is triggered by environmental exposures, which are often iatrogenic, caused by us. And together, these factors lead to profound changes in the brain through classical and operant conditioning, through dysregulation of the neural circuits mediating reward and reward-seeking behavior, through allostatic shifts in how we process pain, incentive salience, and mood that can persist for years after abstinence. And so it's only once we appreciate the central aspect of the disease that we can implement a range of biologically informed approaches. So first, we already have medications that save lives. MAT saves lives. It is unconscionable how badly we as a field are failing to deliver them to individuals in need. We might start to think of novel biological approaches, so interventional tools that could be used to target dysregulated circuits or new medications. Or there was a recent JAMA viewpoint talking about a fentanyl vaccine. They had prototypes successfully created years ago that just didn't get funded. We need to think about how to implement psychotherapies that can leverage the same understanding of neurobiology, contingency management, or new approaches to extinguish condition dissociations or to disrupt reconsolidation. And we need to acknowledge all of the social determinants of health that may be affecting our patients' illnesses. The toxic impact of poverty, of structural racism, of food insecurity, and also how we can leverage sociocultural strengths and a range of psychosocial rehabilitation interventions or other recovery-oriented approaches. And again, at the end of the day, how do we sit with the person in front of us? How do we listen to their life story, try to appreciate what it's like for them to move through this world, and how do we help them find meaning and purpose? We are living at this extraordinary moment in history with a chance to embrace and embody a new vision of what 21st century psychiatry can and ought to be. And there is more potential for growth than we ever thought possible. So I will stop there. And I'm happy to take any questions. Rodolfo, I'm not sure if you have a magic way to coordinate questions, but I will turn it over to you for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. David. Thank you so much. Now I'm gonna move on to Lizzie Shepard to make her comments and also to ask some questions if she wants.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Ross. That was an incredible talk. I learned loads. So I do have a few comments and questions. So I'm really interested in the fact that you always put the research question or whatever you're talking about in its historical context. So you always talk about the history of psychiatry, the history of treatment, and the history of, for example, you talked about the history of racial trauma in your paper. And I think this is really makes your work so much more engaging than if we just talk about define the problem and then talk about current issues. And so I have two questions. So I wondered if history is a really strong interest of yours. And I wondered what you think people might say about our practices in maybe 200 years.
I'm actually not a big history buff in general, but I do think it's really important that we're so used, at least here, to the empty vessel model of medical education that wise, typically old white men can stand up in front of an audience and we can magically pour content into the brains of our trainees. And it's just nonsense, right? It doesn't work that way. And so I've spent a really long time thinking deeply about how do we engage people more meaningfully, and narrative is a core element of that. So for me, it's always why and how did we get here? The one that we jokingly talk about a lot behind the scenes, I think is a great parallel space is there's a podcast called Planet Money. So there's a really interesting sidebar on that with Alex Bloomberg, who created them. But you know, they take topics that most people probably find obscure and unimportant, and by capturing how we ended up in this situation, it offers a really rich way to understand the full complexity of the problem. So that's how I'm thinking about those elements. I think it's going to be. I think we're going to be the next group of people who are doing the best we can with the tools we have at our time, right? You know, so we have a session this afternoon as part of the Brain 2021 course with Godfrey Perlson, who's the creator of BSNP. So as I was talking about Kreplin, right? You know, so Godfrey's led this team that's shown that if you take people that we would currently diagnose with schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and bipolar disorder with psychotic features, you throw them together, you look at every conceivable biomarker you could have, and you just try to cluster and see how they sort. They do sort into 3 groups that they call biotypes, but those biotypes have no relationship whatsoever to our diagnostic categories. Now, Godfrey's team is working to run prospective studies that based on this biotyping, we can say, oh, biotype 1 should get this treatment and biotype 2 should get this treatment and biotype 3 should get this. But as far as I'm aware, those data aren't out. They certainly haven't reached practice guidelines. So what's it like today? I'm going to go to my clinic this afternoon. If I see somebody with a psychotic disorder, what do I do? Well, I don't have a choice. The evidence today says that I do need to diagnose that person using the DSM, because that's what the evidence, that's how all of our evidence is constructed. And the best we can say today is when our treatments don't work, that we can be open to using these new paradigms to help us think about alternatives. Now, I'm giving you the dark half, right? There's plenty of places today where treatment has had a real impact, and it's genuinely different because of neuroscience. But if the question is how is the future going to look, maybe they'll praise our limited success. But I think they're going to focus more on, my God, did they really do that? So we're not there yet, and whether we're 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, but I don't know. It's encouraging seeing the changes that's happening.
Definitely. I think all the new hierarchical and dimensional models of psychiatry are really encouraging, for sure. So I wanted to comment as well as on the module that you guys developed, which is just fantastic. I'm thinking back to my neuroscience training, just sitting in lectures, trying to remember how all the brain circuits connect and drawing brain images to try and remember. So the Play-Doh building of a brain is incredible. And also I really loved how you set the psychiatric difficulties in the context of a human, a patient. So people start thinking about people as people, not just a number. And also considering the wider context of the environment, so racial trauma and poverty, as you said. And I think this is something that really needs to be done in other disciplines as well. So I think, in neuroscience, there are a lot of us who, well, I don't personally, but some neuroscientists just work on data. They never meet the people who contribute the data. So thinking about that is really, really important. And I wondered, how you decide which aspects of neuroscience that you cover in these sessions.
Yeah, great question. It's a mix. We go both directions. So often it's because somebody comes up to us and they say, hey, I have this really cool idea. Can we do this? And so we work with people who come to us with really cool ideas because they're passionate about something. And at the same time, we try to look at the world and say, where are the needs? Where are the most acute needs for education based on things that are happening, and where are we missing? So, the US is been exploding for years. You could say 400 years of structural racism that permeates every aspect of our healthcare system. So for us, it's very clear that we need to be able to look at these topics in a real meaningful way. And so we reached out to 5, 10, 15 different people that we thought could help contribute. And we said, let's try to get more content in that space. Similarly, we looked recently, we said, God, we don't have nearly enough content for women's mental health. And so we reached out to Lauren Osborne, who's been leading efforts, and a handful of authors, and said, okay, let's go. And now we have it's really fun. We have a weekly writing group that sits down and is writing clinical commentaries together, all on women's health. So we've done it in both directions. I think because it's so difficult to capture everything, it's a little bit liberating to just say, where's the cool stuff? Where are the best things? And let's start there and then move out from there.
For sure. I think that's very cool indeed. And I wondered how you come up with all these strategies, these activities. So they are really fun. I find it really difficult to think of these things.
This is what I love. I feel so blessed that I get to do this work. This is how I spend all my time, is like, how do we imagine new, different, fun ways? The fundamental orientation is that the encounter is not about us, it's about our students, right? Yeah. So you have to start from a robust learning objective. As a direct result of this educational intervention, the participant is going to be different in the following way. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you free yourself from that. It doesn't have anything to do with me. It has to do with them. And how can I create an experience that will move them along in their journey from wherever they are a little bit forward in that journey? And once you start getting comfortable playing in that space, it's really fun. We're running a fellowship program now where we have 10 people who we started the year thinking about principles of adult learning and how they apply in graduate medical education and how they apply online. And we literally this morning play a game that's like, okay, we're going to pick random things. Here's your audience. Here's a topic. Here's the session. Come up with a cool new learning approach.
Yes.
It's really fun. It's cool.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Really cool. And I like how you do the kinds of critical review sessions of popular media stories, but also digging in to find out where the science is behind it all. Really, really cool. So I have one final kind of comment and question. So you talked in your last few minutes about stigma and how we must reduce stigma, and we must also consider the environmental context that we know trigger or maintain psychiatric conditions. And this is something I think is really, I don't know how it is in the US, but in the UK, for example, there's a huge disparity between people who really do understand this, but they're mainly at big universities. And then when you go out into actual clinical practice, even kind of GPs and pediatricians, they don't recognize like these contextual factors that can contribute to psychiatric disorders. And I guess I wondered how we can make this information more accessible to the general clinician, even in rural areas who are not involved in research.
Yeah. So I guess my answer would be, I hope that there is an answer to that question. I'm very dedicated to that question. I realize this is a profound issue for our field. So I think part of the answer is I do genuinely believe that education has to be done right. Bad education fails, right? Mm-hmm. And it alienates people and it pushes them further away. If you can do it well, you can bring people into a dialogue and get them personally engaged and committed. So, the opioid stuff at the end is stuff that we've been developing over the past year and a half as we were writing a grant. And the grant was to study, can an educational intervention impact stigma in individuals with opioid use disorder and their providers and empower them to seek treatment. So it's a platform that will engage with both patients who are diagnosed with opioid use disorders who are going to be coming and see their primary care physicians. It's not to see psychiatry, it's primary care. We'll have an intervention with the primary care physician. And the hope would be, the hypothesis is that this moral model permeates both sides, that the patient is ashamed and doesn't want to talk about it, that the physician is angry and pissed off, to be blunt, that this person is making bad choices, and that the work and effort of figuring that out is too much. There's too high an activation energy to get to the outcome you need, which, like no other place in psychiatry, is screamingly obvious. Prescribe a medication that will save their life. This is really simple, but 80% of patients don't get it. Like, what other part of medicine do we have a disease that for us now is 3% mortality per year, 90,000 people? We have a medication that saves lives and we're not giving it. So I would like to believe, I'm going to test the idea that if we can help both sides come together, we can get to those outcomes faster. But you're right. This has been the story of the past at least 5 years of how do you change people's firmly held beliefs? Like whether it's about blaming people with psychiatric illness, or whether it's about vaccines, or whether it's about other ridiculous political shenanigans that are going on. And most of the data suggests it's not very easy to change people's beliefs unless you can do an end around that brings them into personal relationship with the content.
Yes. Well, yeah, but your grant sounds fantastic. I'll be really interested to see what you.
I wish the reviewers felt the same way.
No.
2 out of 3 of the reviewers liked it. The third one was like, I don't like any of this.
Oh.
We'll see. I think it may sneak through. Even if it doesn't, we're going to do the same work. But it's predicated. The person that I would recommend, I could not recommend more highly, is a woman named Janine Austin, who's at the University of British Columbia. She's a genetic counselor who specializes in psychiatric illness and specifically in looking at stigma. And you can Google her and a whole bunch of different resources, but she talks about something called the jam jar model of how to conceptualize the relative impact of genetics and environment on the manifestation and presentation of psychiatric illnesses. And it's genius. And you can look and you can watch her grand rounds and you're just like, oh my God, like this is the approach that we need.
Fantastic. I'll definitely have a look at her stuff. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for for your amazing talk and your amazing work. So I guess I will pass back to Rodolfo for questions.
Yes. Professor Euripides and Professor Orestes, please make your comments. Professor, the audio is muted.
You go. You were the chair. You were the last. Okay, Orestes. So, David, appreciate a lot your investment coming here to give this wonderful talk. It's nice to see how you are developing these models, these ideas, and I was always admire your enthusiasm, enthusiastic investment on this. And so, Lizzie, that's where the creativity starts, I think, with his enthusiastic and dedicated commitment to change education and help us to learn neuroscience. So congratulations. And we are very proud to have you as a visiting professor. So for those of you who does not know, David is a official visiting professor of our department. And I would start by that. So I think we should take advantage of this opportunity that we have, David, here. And I also would like to retribute to David, providing a population, a diverse population that could also help you to think in terms of and contribute some way to the NNCI. You know? I'm seeing here Lizzie, for instance, is one of the first our real neuroscientists here in our institution. And Rodolfo, a very young chief resident. You guys could work together with Paulo Salé and other people to have maybe a space in the NCI where we could contribute and see the reactions of our residents to this practice that we just had a few minutes ago. I was very touched with the experience, the exercise. I think you guys, I first said that I would feel comfortable to talk with this person at the first moment, but probably I don't have this experience when I'm not seeing these people here. They are not coming to tell about their suffering. But after learning and reading a little bit more in depth how you propose it in the exercise, I said I was supposed to say, I imagine that you would like us to say that you are more comfortable now to talk with this person, but I think it's the opposite, because the empathy that you feel, I feel more empathic about their suffering, really much more. But as I validate their suffering, I also feel a little guilty, or I feel a little responsible for, or I should do something about this, right? But I think it's a very nice way to help us to understand our patients and to help them understand their suffering, for sure. So this is also have a very therapeutic impact on our patients. So I really believe in learning neuroscience can change the way we treat our patients. Other than saying that, congratulations. The only thing I'm really wondering how you guys at NCI are thinking regarding the new models of when you try to integrate neuroscience and new methods. How you guys are thinking in terms of the phenotype? I think probably Lizzie mentioned a little bit, but I wonder if you guys are teaching. So Lizzie mentioned the high top or the hierarchical models of psychopathology. How you guys are thinking and teaching dimension? Do you guys have a section about new ways to approach the phenotype in psychiatry and integrative neuroscience? So that's my question. Thanks again, David.
Thank you, Yuri. Yeah, I thank you. I appreciate it. We're working on it. I guess to the very last point. Yeah, we have sessions. The next 2 sessions we're running as part of this online course are with Godfrey, thinking about new approaches for diagnosis. And I don't know, have you met Adam Chekrad? He's a computational guy who's also
he came to Brazil last year. He participated in our Congress last year.
Smart man, right? So so really trying to think, how do we there's lots of opportunities, and we're trying our best, I think, is the answer.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, David, thank you so much for a brilliant talk and for the time you're spending with us in these sessions. Thank you so much. I'll move back to the beginning of your presentation and just ask for your comment on one aspect that is related to neuroscience-based decisions. Well, I'm a very strong enthusiast in neuroscience, doing this in old age psychiatry for several years. And particularly in Alzheimer's disease, we have a very strong biological model. We know the pathophysiology, you have biomarkers for early diagnosis, and you have drugs that might target these pathological changes. Nonetheless, most of the disease-modifying interventions have failed so far. We have some expectations with new anti-amyloid drugs, but still very limited as opposed to the amount of knowledge that we have in this neuroscience-based issue. So I wonder if when we have this model, and perhaps not still able not to integrate other factors that are essential for disease progress, including lifetime experiences and cultural and social issues, also environmental. It's much more difficult to depict this phenomena in biological terms, but I think this is really crucial for the outcome. So I wonder if when you try to, with the tools that we have today, we might lead to an oversimplification of the problem. So we must be aware of that. So and consider other elements that take part in this process and maybe make all the difference towards responses to treatment and so on. So please, I'd like to hear your comments about that.
I think you've stated it perfectly. I don't think I have anything to add above. I would empathize with the pain of the recent history of Alzheimer's research, that it's heartbreaking that we invested massive amounts of money in what felt like a robust model and intervention that failed. And it's heartbreaking for the researchers and for the patients and for society that they haven't worked. I mean, I think the people who are in that space have done what you have to do, which is you take that information and you think more deeply and you look at the models, and there are compelling reasons why they can say this is why it failed, because it was too late and you need to go earlier and you need to look at the tau pathway and you need to look at prion models and like all this other stuff. But I mean, that's the reality, is it's long, slow research. But I couldn't agree more with the point that like this is a part of the story, right? And the reason I used that PTSD case and the opioid use case is to just highlight, right? We are psychosocially complex. And if you look at depression, right, exercise works as well as SSRIs. It works through the same pathway. It leads to increased BDNF and neurogenesis and synaptogenesis, right? So we should be doing that with all of our patients. And we ran a session this week that was really funky. It was one of those neuroscience and media ones, looking at a recent podcast that was basically looking at the impact of social isolation as a causative agent of depression. And there's really good basic neuroscience to show that social isolation causes decreased perception of rewards through the accumbens pathway, right? I mean, so we're psychosocially complex individuals, right? And we have to be thinking about all of these together in a holistic sort of way. You can't talk about neuroscience without the other things. It just doesn't work. I agree completely.
In 200 years, we'll be able to integrate this in a much better way, as Lizzie said.
I'm more optimistic. I think 30 to 50 years.
Less than 200, okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Euripides, do you have time to do a question from the audience? Yes? Okay. I'll make just one question, Professor David. Do you have time? 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Please.
Okay. Fast. That's from Paulo Salé, the chief. Yes. Thank you, David, for your excellent speech and availability to be with us. You and your colleagues from the NNCI project have helped us a lot introducing neuroscience into the resident program here at USP. Together with Philip Kortz, we have been trying to include neuroscience topics in the core curriculum modules according to their respective practical applications. However, we see that maybe, except for the paradigm involving anxiety disorders and experimental drugs such as ketamine and brexanolone, in other areas of psychiatry, it seems that we still do not have great neuroscientific advance with practical application in therapy and management. If you add this limitation to the relative lack of basic knowledge of neuroscience in residency programs, which compromise the critical appreciation of neuroscientific findings, would it not be too hasty trying to fit perspectives not yet solidified in clinical experience? And then, since practical application would be the way to introduce neuroscience, how have you been dealing with the relative scarcity of clinical applications in other areas and the teaching of neuroscience in psychiatry programs?
Paulo, are you saying that's one question? That's not one question. Thanks. Okay, so look, I love the question. I think it's a great question, and I think it's really thoughtful, and I appreciate it. So let me try to answer in a couple of different ways. One is, I hear you. It is really hard to integrate into a curriculum. And what you're talking about, I believe, is also the same thing that I described as this hidden curriculum of classroom versus clinical tensions. And if we talk about it in the classroom, but it doesn't show up in the clinic, it feels less important, less impactful. And it is true that much of neuroscience has not translated into direct interventions like ketamine or brexanolone, right? Or with anxiety disorders. But I would take issue with a more basic piece, which is the neuroscience can inform our care even if there's not a mechanical thing that we do at the end of that pathway, if it's helping us understand and connect with our patients better. So Paulo, you were here last time I came, right? And we did a case of somebody with what would conventionally be called borderline personality disorder, and talked about the relevant biology and looking at early trauma and epigenetic regulation of the HPA axis. Okay, do we have a new medication that we prescribe based on that? No. But does it change the way that you sit with a patient with that and allow you to, so often we get caught in these behavioral situations where we get frustrated and the systems of care get frustrated and you know, the formal term would be hate in the countertransference, right? Because we don't understand. We think they're manipulating, we think they're behaving badly, and the reality is they have a disease of affect dysregulation. And that biology is very well understood. So why should we be upset with a patient who has a disease of dysregulated affect? So I would say we should be talking about that every single day with every patient like that we're treating, because it helps us sit in a space with them. And I think the same thing with the functional neurological disorder or PNES. I think that there are lots of examples in that space that we should turn to, and it should be a part of our identity. I get that it's hard in some spaces to translate, but I think there's a lot of productive work and struggle that we could be engaging there that would be productive.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor David Ross. And Professor Euripides Orestes, would you like to end up the meeting? No?
Great, we are very grateful, David. Great honor to have you here, and appreciate a lot your investment in our department. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.
We will contact you soon to see if we can collaborate more closely with you in the NCI.
I would love to talk about that. And honestly, the easiest thing would be like, we have this massive online course that we're running, and it would be very easy to plug in trainees who are interested, or not trainees, or faculty who are interested to engage in this space and be a part of the dialogue. So I would love to think with you about that.
Wonderful. Let's set to talk about that, right?
Yes. Translate it into Portuguese language, no?
What's that?
To translate into Portuguese language.
Yeah. So we should talk, but we have somebody up here who can at least partially help, potentially. We can think about it. Yeah. All right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody. Good to meet you, Lizzie. Good to meet you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
See everyone next week. Bye-bye.